In this lesson, we cover Skylight portal option in Arealights that we skipped in the previous lesson. That was because we actually needed another scene to be able to fully understand what this option is for. I really want to avoid one-dimensionality in this course. That means I don't want to start the lesson with fully prepared scenes and simply fire up the render and quickly explain the options. As we are working with a new scene and our topic is lighting, let's go through the basic approach of lighting process for an interior scene. And as we do so, we also learn about Skylight portal, which is the topic of this lesson. Obviously, I'll be going through the complete process of interior lighting in one of our upcoming lessons, but here I just give you a taste. So this is the scene we are working with. As you can see, we have a simple room. It has some windows, curtains. We have this chair and this lamp, and also a V-Ray physical camera. I also have these two dummy objects so I can position the sunlight the way I've done in the preparation for this lesson. So first of all, I want you to select your V-Ray physical camera, and in the exposure rollout, make sure the exposure is set to 10. If this currently grayed out exposure control installed button is enabled, make sure to click on it to install the proper exposure control in the scene, and then make sure the exposure is basically set to 10. When you are working with an interior lighting situation, the first thing you do is to add a sun. And in the V-Ray toolbar, you can see that we have the V-Ray sun. Now select it, and in the top view, click and drag the sun in the direction that you want it to shine through the windows into the room. As I mentioned earlier, I have these two dummy objects to help with positioning and direction of the sun. The sunlight will be discussed in detail in one of the future lessons. Now, we get this message which asks us whether to add a V-Ray sky environment map or not. Basically, when you create a sun, V-Ray also wants to add a sky to the environment. And the sun and sky in V-Ray work hand in hand to create a realistic lighting for you. So I would say yes. Also in the front view, let's make sure our sun has an appropriate height. If I press 8 to open the environment and effects window, as you can see, we have a V-Ray sky map as the environment map. Great. Now I can start the render using this button in the V-Ray toolbar, which is the render current frame in the production mode. Let's start the render. Now I'm going to stop it right now. You can continue and see the results for yourself, but to increase the pace, I've already done that. So if I open up the history window, this would be the result of adding the sunlight to our scene. As you can see, the result isn't quite desirable. It is a bit darker compared to a typical daytime image. In these situations, we need to use Skylight portal option of our V-Ray light to brighten the scene and help V-Ray direct more light from the environment into the room. In order to do that, we add a light to all of our windows. So make sure to enable Skylight portal option, and by doing so, we have helped V-Ray to make the lighting more realistic. So let's here close our frame buffer to be able to see the windows. I'm going to double click on this container which called curtains and hide all the curtains. Now in V-Ray toolbar, I'm going to select V-Ray plane light. Make sure that vertex snapping is enabled. Now maximize the front view and zoom in a bit here. And now let's create a light based on our Windows profiles. Great, now I can unhide my curtains. Now let's go to the top view, select the light and rotate it 90 degrees. And let me here turn off snapping. And I'm just going to put the light slightly inside the room. And the next thing I want to do is to make sure that this light doesn't affect the curtains, because this light is going to help V-Ray bring in more light into the room. It would be so sad to see all that new light is going to be blocked by the curtains. So in the modify panel, even though the curtains, the materials that we have applied to the curtains are kind of translucent and allow some level of light to kind of go through them, but in this case I just want to make sure that all the light that is coming from the lights that we have just created is going to be able to enter the room. So in the modify panel, click on the exclude button in the option rollout. Now select the curtains and press OK. Now the most important thing you need to do is to enable the Skylight portal option, and as you do so you can see tons of V-Ray light parameters are becoming grayed out. You can see like multiplier, color, texture, cast shadow, and so on. That's because this light is getting its intensity and color from the environment and the objects that are behind it. So here let me create a few instances of this light and put them in our windows. Shift drag the light, make sure instance is enabled, and set the copy numbers to 2. Okay, now we have 3 Skylight portals in our scene. Let's get back to our camera and see what the render is going to look like. Open up V-Ray's virtual frame buffer, and this is the render with the new lights and Skylight portal enabled. As you can see, compared to our previous render, it's quite brighter and more realistic. Also, as you can see, the render time has increased by about 4 minutes, but the result definitely worth that extra time. Now, if you select the V-Ray light, you can see we have this simple option besides Skylight's portal option. Now, if this option is enabled, the light will only use the colors from the environment map, which in this case is a V-Ray sky and not other objects or foliage, for example, that might be behind the portal light in our environment. Let me enable this simple option here. And in the frame buffer, this would be the result that we are going to get with this option enabled. As you can see, it's not quite different compared to the previous render. That's because we don't have anything like, for example, trees or in the outside of the house to affect the lighting that much. But as you can see, the render time is quite faster and the scene is a tad brighter compared to when we only had Skylight portal option enabled. Now, before wrapping the lesson, let's prepare our scene for the final render. Open up the render setting windows. In the comment tab, increase the size to something like 1200 by 1600. And in the V-Ray tab and bucket image sampler rollout, change the max subdiv to something like 50. Decrease the noise threshold to 0.007. And make sure the noise threshold in this is the same basically for the global DMC rollout as well. Now in the GI tab, change the irradiance map preset to medium. Set the subdiv to something like 70, 80, and samples to 25. Now set the light cache subdivs to something like 1200. And in the render elements tab, let's add V-Ray denoiser. Now change its preset to mild so it wouldn't denoise our render that much. Great. Now let's render. Now I have rendered it before, so let's in the frame buffer take a look at what we have. It took about an hour and 40 minutes on this machine, but as you can see, the result is quite lovely. You can see here it says it took 8 minutes. That's because I had to actually re-render some parts of the image because of the 3ds Max crash that I had while rendering, and combine it with the previous render, so that is not the real number. And that is the denoise version as a separate image. I use the external V-Ray denoiser tool to get this image from the render because, as I mentioned, I had to render this image in 2 phases. I'm going to show you how to use standalone V-Ray denoiser tool, which is amazing, later on. Now let me save this image as EXR. If you are trying to save it as JPG or PNG, make sure to enable the override checkbox and set the gamma to 2.2. But in this case, we are saving it as 16-bit EXR. So let's press OK. Also, let's do some basic color correction in Photoshop. You can actually close this lesson right now if you are not quite sure to follow or not, because as I mentioned, I don't want to really just explain the option and finish it. I want to just explain some processes and some workflows as I go through these lessons to make sure you understand how to finish the job and how to go through different processes and different stuff that you need to do for finishing your job. So this lesson is basically finished, and we explained the concept of Skylight portal, but in this case I want to continue and color correct the image very quickly in Photoshop as well, so I can give you a bit more information about that process too. Now let's open up the render in Photoshop. Okay, you have 2 options: alpha channel data as transparency or alpha channel. If you want to keep the exact look of the environment behind the windows, make sure to enable as alpha channel. And if you want to mess with the background, maybe replace the sky or something like that, you can enable as transparency. In this case, I don't want to mess anything, so let's have as alpha enabled and press OK. Now double click on the layer and unlock it. From the image menu, change the mode to 16 bits per channel. Great. Now let me duplicate the layer so I can have a copy of the original image. Rename this layer to original. Now select the other layer. From the filter menu, choose camera raw filter. And let's quickly adjust the render here a bit. Change the white balance to a warmer temperature, like maybe 7, 10, 5, something like that. And add a bit of contrast, maybe something like 50. Okay, that would be enough. I don't want to really go through all of these options. It's just going to be some basic color correction, and maybe we can go through more advanced color correction in the upcoming lessons, but for now that would be enough. Now let's duplicate the layer again and apply a Gaussian blur with a radius of around maybe 5, something like that, and press OK. Now change the blending mode to soft light and the opacity to maybe 25%. And that would be our basic final color graded image. Now you can go ahead and save it as JPG or PNG or whatever format that you wish. In this lesson, we talked about Skylight portal and learned how to use it in an interior lighting scenario.